So today I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the OHM and cosmological objects. So the main reason I am trying to promote these OHM is because I want to draw attention to the fact that these interesting mathematical objects look strikingly similar to actual cosmological objects that we see in space. So on the right here is one such cosmological object referred to as NGC 3132. Now this image is a James Webb Space Telescope near-infrared image of NGC 3132, which is a planetary nebula. And so I've been saying all along that these OHM look very much like cosmological objects such as planetary nebula and galaxy clusters. And so here is one example of an OHM that I believe looks very much like NGC 3132, and I'll show you why. So on the left here we have an OHM that I actually picked from our collection. This is actually one of the OHM from the collection, and I recolorized it to match the colors of NGC 3132, at least the near-infrared coloring that they chose when they rendered this image. And so you can see down here, I was able to load this picture into my OHM generator, and I was able to colorize it with these colors. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on a region down here because I thought it was very interesting how this OHM has very similar kind of striations in the structure as the NGC, as the Planetary Nebula, referred to as NGC 3132. Okay, so you can see all the way around the boundary of this planetary nebula, which is representative of an explosion, because planetary nebula are formed when a star basically explodes, and so these are the structures that are formed after an explosion. So you can see very similar structures as here in the OHM, and so I'm going to zoom in a little bit to show you that there are very similar shapes. They're very similar. The lines are going in very similar directions as they are in the actual planetary nebula. And so I'm just going to shift a little bit to the left here because you can see that there is also quite a bit of noise going on at the interface between this planetary nebula and in space. And so you see similar, what you see is kind of a lot of noise going on. Okay, you see a lot of noise going on, a lot of stars in the background, of course, and this is interestingly very analogous, very similar to the edge effect that you see here on the OHM is very similar to what we see at the very edge, at the boundary of this planetary nebula. Okay, so I'm just going to zoom around a little bit more. I'm going to zoom in a bit more here, and I'm going to go and look at this region up here. Let me just zoom over here. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my software to navigate over to that region, similar region, analogous region in the OHM. And so here you can see that you can see very similar structures going on up here as you do up here. You see a lot of noise going on, but as you get closer to the center of the planetary nebula, you tend to see these kind of striations in the image, and you also see that there are very distinctive layers. You can actually see this better when you zoom out, and so here's a zoomed out version of the planetary nebula and the OHM, and you can see that in the OHM-Particle, the way I've painted it, the way I ran this simulation, you can see these very distinct striations, or these very distinct color bands, and you can see over here that there are very distinct color bands. Over here it is dark, and then it gets lighter, and then you have a bright region around here. So I am able to simulate that the textures of this planetary nebula quite nicely using this OHM-Particle technology. And so I'm going to zoom in just to get a closer look at this region here. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here. Okay, we'll have a look at a similar region based on the orientation of these two objects. And so this is a nice view where you can see the combination of these sort of streaks, which were caused by the supposedly caused by the explosion of this planetary nebula, and the textures that you see, both the layering and the structures that are formed are very similar between these two structures. And so this is why I thought that these OHM-Particles were more than just pretty pictures. And so I think they're very pretty. But there is also a potentially scientific or mathematical reason why these two objects produce similar forms, and I think it's because the iterative process that we use to generate the OHM-Particles, okay, the iterative process is analogous to, very similar to what you would see in an explosion, where the star explodes and creates shock waves throughout the material in this structure and creates very similar forms. So I think there's kind of a relationship between how planetary nebulae are formed and these OHM-Particles, which we find in the complex plane, that look surprisingly like the cosmological objects that we see in space. Okay, so this is the reason why I am doing all of this. Okay, this is the reason I'm doing this, is because I want people to see how interesting this. I want people to see how similar that these are from each other, and I want people to have fun with it. They don't have to understand it. Truthfully, I don't understand it. I don't understand why these objects look so much like these objects, other than the fact that everything in the universe is a fractal, and fractals have the property of self-similarity. And so these two structures can be considered as being self-similar to each other. And so there could definitely be a mathematical and physical relationship between what you're seeing over here and what we're seeing over here.